Almost got everybody in. Just keep emitting, keep emitting. Good afternoon, everybody.
I'll go ahead and start.
Sure.
Yeah. Saludos a todos. Mi nombre es Omar Herrera de Café Imports y solo quería pues darle la opción de prender subtítulos para los que no hablan inglés o los que solo hablan español. Hi everyone, my name is Omar. I'm from Café Imports, one of the presenters today. I just wanted to give everyone the option if you do, if English is not your primary language and you wanted subtitles turned on, you can go ahead and do that. I'll be saying the rest of this in Spanish, but here it is in English as well. En la parte superior derecha de la pantalla pueden hacer clic donde dice más, seguir a idioma y voz y seguir a activar subtítulos en vivo. Después de prender los subtítulos, pueden ir a la parte inferior derecha de la pantalla y seleccionar más opciones. Déjame ver aquí. No, aquí estamos. Seleccionar más opciones, subtítulos y elegir la idioma en la que la quieren traducir. Y para traducir las dispositivas de PowerPoint, hacerle clic en más opciones en la parte inferior izquierda de la pantalla, hacerle clic en traducir dispositivas, elegir idioma y después la idioma preferida. Entonces, eso lo pueden hacer ahorita mismo para tener la opción de tener subtítulos en español. So go ahead and follow these two steps. If English or if you have a preferred language that you'd like this translated into, there's various different languages there that you can have subtitles chosen for. So here's part 1 and step 3. All right, Dylan, I'll turn it over to you.
Perfect. Again, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for our first ever special topics. Please bear with us as we kind of figure out this program. If you have any technical issues, feel free to use the Q&A. Let me know and we'll get those resolved for you as soon as we can. But I just wanted to go over a couple quick housekeeping things and we'll turn it over to today's presenters. So we are using the Q&A function. Go ahead and open that, and that's where you can submit any questions you think of in the moment or at the end when we get to our Q&A portion. Those messages will come to me. I'll approve them before they go out. So again, that's a great way to communicate any issues you have there. Once a question is posted in Q&A, anybody can respond to it. So feel free to add anything in there. We'll all be able to see it there. So yeah, we'll use Q&A. We are recording this, and it's possible that it could be published somewhere else. So feel free to leave your camera on or off, whatever you prefer. After the meeting, we might send a follow-up survey just asking you how it went, if there's anything we can improve, any thoughts for the next time. And if you want to keep in contact about this topic, or if there's other topics you want to talk about that we should do in the future, feel free to email us, education@cafeimports.com. And then we have a small disclaimer here. It goes without saying, but we don't tolerate any harassment. So please keep, all of your chat positive toward one another. And yeah, we're very excited to finally be able to do this and talk about a topic that we've been thinking about for a long time. So today we're talking about anaerobic fermentation. Our presenters are Omar, Ian, and Taya. They're all just extremely, incredibly smart professionals in their fields. Omar is a green buyer in Colombia. Ian is our head of sensory analysis. And Dr. Taya Brown is a field researcher and educator here at Café Imports. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to them. And yeah, thank you so much for joining.
All right. Thank you, Dylan. Thank you guys all for being here. We're really excited about this series and excited about this conversation today to kind of kick off this series. I'm going to just jump right in with some terminology. This might seem a little basic to some people, but I think it's important to understand the terms that we're using, make sure that that when we use terms that we're all thinking about the same thing, that the term reflects the same kind of concepts for all of us. So we're going to start really basic. with a process. The noun version of that term is a series of actions or steps taken in order to achieve a particular end. And let's forget how to change these slides. There we go. To process, so the verb form is to perform a series of mechanical or chemical operations on a thing in order to change or preserve it. So in other words, to process something means to carry out a series of actions in a particular order with an intended outcome in mind for the thing that's being processed. In coffee, processing means removal of the fruit layers, including the skin, mucilage, and parchment, and then drying or curing that seed for quality retention and shelf stability. Very basic steps of processing to the wet milling section or part of the processing is sorting to remove anything we don't want to taste, skin removal, so taking off the skin that's on the outside of the fruit, mucilage removal, the sticky stuff that's that sits between the skin and the parchment or seed, and then drying or curing. In every case, we start with fresh cherry. And depending on the ways, the choices that we make in processing, we end either with dry parchment or dry cherry. So that's the basic purpose of processing, is to take our fresh cherry and end with a dry product. Coffee processes, to use kind of a different variation of that term, at their very basic form are honey, natural, and washed. There are variations on these and more detailed versions of these. Some are on our website. Some of you probably have others in mind right now, but at the very, very basic level, we have honey, natural, washed, which essentially differ just by the point in the process at which the skin is removed, and that's all. Then there's this word modulation, which is an action taken to control or adjust a process, which I'll come back to in a little bit. So here's our timeline of processing. We start with our fresh cherry and we want to end with our dry parchment or dry cherry. And we have this guy to contend with. We've got sticky, wet skin, mucilage that's all stuck on the outside of that parchment. So in order to get from our cherry to our dry product, these are our steps again: sorting, removing skin, removing mucilage. And in order to remove mucilage, there are two main steps. One is to ferment, and which brings in the power of microorganisms, which break down carbon chains and lattices and starches and sugars and sort of break those into smaller pieces that are easier to dislodge from the surface of the parchment. And then we have the washing step. And washing, there's kind of two parts to washing. There's just rinsing away those carbon chain particles that are left after fermentation. And then there's usually a little bit of turbulence added to with a paddle or some other sort of mechanism, which helps dislodge those particles from the parchment layer and then wash away with the water. Let's look at these timelines for our three very basic processes. Again, start with cherry, sort to remove anything we don't want to taste, take the skin off through depulping, and then we have our fermentation step, and then our washing step, and then what's left from there, our wet, clean parchment will go out to dry or go into a machine to dry. And then a little bit simplified process is honey. Again, start with cherry, sort out anything we don't want to taste, remove the skin, and then we leave some layer of the mucilage on that parchment, and that goes out to dry. And then we have natural, kind of the most simplistic process of all, is start again with cherry, just take out anything we don't want to taste, and essentially that coffee as is in whole cherry can go out to dry. So these are just very basic timelines of how processing takes place in the different processes. So when we talk about anaerobic fermentation, where that comes in is really only in this step, which is part of the mucilage removal phase of the process. That step, fermentation, is done in an anaerobic environment. So that's the only thing that is modified or modulated when we're referring to anaerobic fermentation, just that step. So looking again at our timelines, honey, natural, and washed, We can see the anaerobic fermentation added to any of these processes. And the point I'm making here is that anaerobic fermentation is not a process in of itself, but it's a modulation to a process. So anaerobic fermentation can happen to any of the processes. It's not a process in of itself. So what is anaerobic fermentation? I will argue or posit here that it is a modulation to the process because it is an action taken to control or adjust the process. And again, coming back to our timelines, there are many other modulations that we are hearing about. There's the addition of yeast in fermentation, and this isn't just one type of yeast. I've got one color here to denote yeast, but really there are many different kinds of yeast being used in fermentation. And then we can add another fermentation step for a double fermentation. That's something that's being done. We're hearing more about temperature shocks being done as well, which is another type of modulation. And then this koji step is gaining popularity. So you can see there's a lot of different types of modulations that can take place, and each of them take place on a basic process. So each of them is a modulation to a process, and they each add their own impact to the flavor outcome of that coffee. So takeaways from what I just talked about: anaerobic fermentation is not a processing method in of itself. It's better stated as a modulation to a processing method. And the way we talk about these coffees and anaerobic coffee, it's real easy to use those terms. You'll hear us use that exact term in this presentation here today. But I'm going to argue that it's a little bit misleading the way we're talking about these coffees because it sounds like a process. It sounds like we're saying a washed coffee or a natural coffee, an anaerobic coffee, when really there are other descriptors like the processing method still to know, other modulations that might have taken place, and also the length of time that the anaerobic step was done for, that are all interesting, add context to what the producers are doing and the investment being made, and time and equipment types of investment being made, and also what is actually creating the flavor profile that is the outcome of these. How do these taste? I'm going to say that we're still learning, although Ian's going to give you an idea of what we currently know at Cafe Imports from what we are tasting, which is really pretty fascinating. But I'm going to say that we are still learning about this. We're sort of in somewhere along the process of learning, partially because of the use of terminology. I think if we were a little bit clearer on what we're calling an anaerobic coffee, what are we talking about? A coffee that went through 24 hours, which is really just sort of like a pre-ferment stage, or a coffee that went through 4 days in the anaerobic environment. The way we talk about these right now, the term anaerobic coffee applies to both cases. However, I think that the flavor outcomes of that are actually quite different. So I think we're still learning how to use the terminology, and therefore we're still learning, what these modulations produce as far as cut profile outcomes. I'll just go ahead and address this sort of elephant in the room. Anytime we're talking about anaerobic fermentation or using these terms together these days, the point has been brought up that to use this terminology is redundant or somehow misleading because the actual chemical reactions that take place during fermentation don't involve oxygen. I'm going to push back on that a little bit here today and say that I don't think that we're referring to the chemical reactions that are taking place when we're using the term anaerobic. What we are referring to is the space being created around the coffee. There's a lot of investment being made into creating those environments with specialized equipment, specialized tools to assess what's going on in the tanks, specialized know-how to understand what's going on in the tanks and understand what's going on with the coffees as they go through the fermentation. And we know that that anaerobic environment fosters very different microbes than the aerobic environment. Therefore, it is a targeted thing that we're doing. We're making this investment in time, labor, etc., to create different flavor outcomes, to foster that environment for different microbes. And because of that, I think that it's just fine to use the term anaerobic fermentation for now. One other thing that I want to bring up here before I turn the mic over to Ian is this this concept of trendiness and livelihoods. As a green coffee importer, Cafe Imports is responsible for navigating the trends, for bringing roasters the coffees that they're interested in, that they heard about in a competition, or that they tried somewhere and or have heard about in other ways and are starting to gain interest in. We want to have really great, cool, interesting, fun coffees for all roasters. And at the same time, we are very aware of our responsibility in that we have direct relationships and are in direct communication with producers all of the time as well. So we are cautious about jumping on these trends to the point that maybe we have more of our offerings, like all of our offerings being these sort of trendy modulations or modified processes, but we need to be aware that in transmitting the message to producers that these coffees get a higher price or higher value, that we are sending them the message that they should invest in that specialized equipment and know-how and time and labor. Some of these techniques really don't work for everyone. There's a major temperature factor in anaerobic. If you're going to put something in an anaerobic environment, if anybody's ever left, a sealed bag in their car in the hot sun or something, it doesn't end well. So you have to really be careful with the temperature, and the microbial environment is different even from farm to farm. So in some cases, we see people jump in thinking that this trend is just great and that they're going to gain a high value for their coffee and end up ruining their coffee. Sometimes also the anaerobic fermentation will produce a higher number of defects. So you just have to cull and take out more of your coffee. So you reduce the amount of your coffee that gets that high value. So those are some of the things that we've seen happen when producers sort of jump in on the trend. And then at the same time, there's this other issue of sustaining this interest over time. So right now, this is kind of a hot topic. People are calling us, asking for anaerobic coffees a lot, and we see a lot of interest in them, which is part of why we're talking about this today. If that interest doesn't sustain, if we happen to be in kind of a bubble of that interest and we transmit the message or share the message with producers that these coffees are really sought after and are gaining a high price, and if in a couple of years that interest wanes, we have to be careful and understand where that leaves producers. So if we all of a sudden can't buy as many of these kind of coffees, and we've seen producers go like full on investment into special tanks and specialized knowledge and even special houses or buildings to house all of this, and we back off on wanting to buy those because the interest wanes, then we're aware that that leaves producers in a bad spot. So these are things that this is a conversation and just sort of thoughts that I don't necessarily have answers to, but I just wanted to bring it up here because it's part of what we navigate as importers. And with that, I will turn the mic over to Ian, who's going to talk to us about the flavor profiles that we're seeing in his lab.
Okay, hey everybody. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for the intro there, Taya. So yeah, we're going to talk about scoring profile and volume trends that we've been seeing in the lab over the last handful of years. So as you can see here, we've got a chart showing some average scores and volumes going back to 2020. 2020 being the first year where we really started to see a notable uptick in samples that were labeled anaerobic. And this is an important point as I'm talking about anaerobic samples. As we're looking at charts like this, this is only tracking samples that are explicitly labeled anaerobic. We have a number of partners that utilize an anaerobic stage as outlined by Taya, but don't necessarily label it on the sample. Running a sample room, there's a chain of custody kind of best practice that if it doesn't say it on the label, you don't push it through, you don't make an assumption and push it into the data. So what this means is that especially in terms of volume, these are pretty conservative numbers. They're a little bit understated. As you can see, as you saw in the last chart, there was a little dip in scoring, and we see that again here for 2023. Overall, scoring on these samples that have been labeled anaerobic, really at this point coming from all over the world, has been pretty stable. Top, bottom, and middle stuff there. That dip in 2023 this year is actually not a dip that we're seeing in cup profile or coffee quality. This actually is reflective of a shift that we've made internally in terms of cupping protocol, and it impacts anaerobics kind of in particular. So this shift that we've made in cupping protocol is this cupping form called the coffee rose. It is a cupping form that's built onto or into an interactive flavor wheel. And the reason that this is impacting anaerobically modulated coffees is really that it just has it's sensitive to this wider spectrum of tasting experience than our prior quantitative cupping form was, or really than a preference-based cupping form would be. So it's providing more nuance and also connection between the descriptive process and the scoring or valuation process. So with the coffee rose, we're sensitive to intensity, just like in a quantitative form. More intense has more impact on the cup profile. It has more impact on the score. We're sensitive to specificity of descriptors. So this is the difference between a simple and a specific descriptor. I could say that a coffee tastes fruity or like fruit, or I could say that it tastes like fresh apricot. That latter, that fresh apricot, is of course much more specific, and in that sense has a greater impact on the cup experience, and then for us a greater impact in most cases on the valuation of the coffee in question. And then finally, we're also sensitive with the coffee rose to content. This is a qualification step, or sort of a gauging the premiumness of a given descriptor. So in our system, fresh apricot has more value than cooked cranberry. Now, that is not to say that fresh apricot is a better coffee descriptor than cooked cranberry. It's literally just to say that we've made a decision in terms of valuation of descriptors, and fresh apricot is a more valuable descriptor to us in coffee. This comes up for us here because cooked cranberry is a pretty common flavor in anaerobically modulated coffees. Even more common, like cooked cranberry, like cranberry sauce with a little bit of orange zest. That's a pretty common descriptor or profile that we might see in a lot of anaerobically modulated coffees. So this multi-dimensional sensitivity to the coffee tasting experience is responding to, in particular, to anaerobic coffees that are very intense, but don't necessarily have, in all cases, the highest value attributes as defined in our valuation system. So as we're talking about anaerobically modulated coffees and their profiles, we see 4 broad profiles with these samples. Of these 4, I think that they really are dominated by one primary, highly identifiable profile. And in all cases, or in most cases, when we're talking about coffees that are expressing anaerobic profiles, these coffees are differentiated from others by really an increased presence of carboxylic acids. And these are the acids that I think make anaerobic modulated coffees so divisive. Some people love them because they're intense and wild and interesting, and other people don't like them so much because they say they taste fermenty. And when you look at the acids that are really present here, you can see we've got vinegary, winey, boozy, cheesy, and tangy. Butyric, very early in the anaerobic sampling process, 2018, 19, early 2020, we saw a lot of very butyric coffees, and they were quite off-putting. Like really like ripe cheese. So this is something that you have to know going in as you're assessing anaerobic coffees. So as I mentioned, we have 4 main profiles that we're looking at here. This primary profile, the one that we'll circle back to more details on all of these, but this primary one is very intense. It's immediately recognizable. I think you can open a roasted coffee bag, or we keep coffees in tins sometimes, open up a little tin, and you can tell what you're about to taste right away. Just the aromas coming off of the whole bean, pretty obvious right away there. It's intense, it's boozy, it's fruity, and it's often very floral. There's a second profile that is fairly common, and this is sort of a nutty amaretto-like profile. It's actually fairly unique and interesting. Get back to it. Some anaerobics don't show any novel traits, by which I mean they don't show any like, oh, this is an obvious anaerobic. Some samples just don't do that. They just taste like their underlying process. So it just tastes like a washed or a honey or a natural, or maybe some taste just like mild versions of points 1 and 2 here. And then finally, I think one of the more interesting developments is some anaerobics show what I'm calling a subtle amplification or a subtle enhancement of attributes that are or were characteristic of a type or an origin. So between number 1 here, the primary profile, and this thing number 4, we're really on pretty separate ends of a taste experience spectrum, where this primary profile, the intense one, we see that in every origin with every process. We see it across the board, and it's all about this is an anaerobic. Whereas this last one, it seems that there are some anaerobic modulated coffees that are, in some senses, really actually opening up the terroir of the coffee, location, variety, etc. So an example, and where we first started seeing this, was with Ethiopian coffees, where they had seemed to get cleaner and cleaner and cleaner over the last handful of years, less and less prominent with apricot in washed and blueberry in naturals. And then suddenly we started to see apricot and blueberry again, and often those were actually anaerobically modulated coffees. So this primary profile is maybe 75%, maybe 80% of samples. In a minute, Omar will help call that into question and put some perspective on that, and it'll reflect back on what I mentioned. This is just coffees that are labeled as anaerobic as they come to us as samples, but these are big coffees. They're boozy and winey. Frequently they have this cooked, jammy, or dried berry flavor. I'd say most often for us, we're talking about cooked berries and dried berries. Cranberry and fresh coffee cherry are again the primary ones here. Really nice examples are more blackberry, cherry, and plum. There is a, to me, very characteristic floral flavor. It is potpourri or perfume-like, and within that context, rose and geranium. Sometimes it tastes like or smells like cologne, or has this strong penetrating sort of artificial component to it. When it's really nice, it has this sort of elderflower or Saint Germain, if you're familiar with that. Very heady, but perfumed and floral aromatic component. Sugar browning in these coffees, in my experience, tends to be more clove or baking spice-like, less chocolatey, less caramely, less burnt sugar, cola, vanilla, less of that, and more, again, really aromatic. Clove, nutmeg, cardamom. Sweetness, I've seen some people consider these to be more sweet. In my experience, they're actually just really intensely flavorful and not usually as sweet as, not as sweet as the rest of the attributes that are getting in these coffees. And in many cases, not quite as sweet as corresponding coffees from a given region or a given coffee variety. There's also often a notable bitter component in these, especially in that primary, really intense boozy profile. There's often a bitter aftertaste or a little bit of, we'll call it a bitter bite. Sometimes that just is adding to complexity. Sometimes that is, again, something that might be a little bit more off-putting to people who are not as interested in that really wild profile. Secondary profiles, I mentioned the amaretto profile. This is maybe 5% of samples that we're seeing. It's still very winey. So thinking of amaretto, of course, as a nutty flavor, but this is not nutty like a Brazil might be, where there's a large salt component. This is still a winey or even tangy acidic coffee. It's just that the fruit forward component and the floral forward component is replaced by this amaretto type of flavor. If you've tasted one of these adjunct coffees with cinnamon, for example, the experience of tasting one of these amaretto anaerobic modulated coffees is kind of has a similar vibe to that. I think these mild coffees, this is kind of a guesstimate, but I would say 10 to 15%. Again, we don't really know how often people are using this stage of modulation and processing, so this number could be significantly higher than that. And then this idea of subtle amplification, it's pretty minor in terms of the samples that we're seeing, but I'd say it's 1% and growing. We started to see it in Ethiopia and had that resurgence of apricot and blueberry flavors. When this happens, we tend to see a richer sugar browning. So start moving away from that clove and nutmeg and cardamom and spice flavor and getting back into more vanilla, cola, burnt sugar, dark chocolate, cacao kind of sugar browning component. And then with these, we also tend to see an increased sweetness level. We've also started to we started to recently see this sort of subtle amplification in Colombian coffees that have been anaerobically modulated. So to me, this is the most interesting part of the whole conversation, to see if this component of the modulation can, find a home, take root, and really start to develop and flower. And I'm really curious to see where this particular component of this modulation takes us in the coming years.
Sorry, I'll unmute myself. Hi, everyone. My name's Omar Herrera. I am one of the green buyers at Cafe Imports with a focus on Colombia. That's the only origin that I operate in, and I buy all of our Colombian coffees. Today, I'm going to speak a little bit about kind of what we're seeing at origin, our kind of take on how this process has unfolded and what it kind of means for what's happening on the ground. I'm not going to pretend to know the entire history of anaerobic modulation or the scientific basis for how this is actually carried out. I'm mostly going to speak to what we are seeing as an importing company with boots on the ground and with a long history of working in Colombia. So this photo here, and mostly just showing photos, there's no slides with a bunch of words and stuff. Like I said, most of this stuff is going to be kind of anecdotal. So this photo here is just what traditional kind of washed fermentation looks like. There's coffee underneath all that water there. And again, this is an environment that is being worked on without oxygen. But it's something that we maybe don't refer to necessarily as anaerobic, right? As Taya said, we are talking, when we say anaerobic, we're talking about the environment and not the actual reaction that is happening. We started seeing these kind of grow in popularity really about 10 years ago. Sorry, I'll go back to this slide. We started seeing these kind of grow in popularity about 10 years ago. Experiments starting maybe in 2013 with folks like in our network, like Elkin Guzman, Andres Roldan. We saw it happen in Finca Immaculada as well. We started hearing about this, these environments where people are processing coffee with little to no oxygen. We found it very interesting, but it wasn't something that maybe the market on the demand side was really asking for, or there wasn't really a need to kind of explore this as much. The way that I saw it kind of fold out or kind of grow in popularity was kind of with this feedback loop. So when a coffee producer is producing coffee and they find someone that they are maybe dedicated to selling their coffee, someone that they trust, someone that they want to build history and relationship with, someone who offers a really fair price for coffees, they start to develop this kind of feedback loop with their coffee. They produce the coffee, they deliver it at a purchase point. The cupper or the exporter says, your coffee tasted like this. It's either, we're either going to pay a high price as a micro lot for it, or we're going to pay kind of more a standard price for a regional coffee or what we call galopes or a different type of product, right? At that point, oftentimes what happens is that there's this kind of like anecdotal feedback loop that's happening. The cuppers and the exporters aren't necessarily scientists. They're not also watching producers ferment these coffees or process these coffees on their farm, but they are giving advice and feedback. So if a farmer comes and delivers a coffee that is lacking sweetness, that is lacking maybe fruitiness, it's kind of just a standard washed coffee, a cupper might say, well, you should probably ferment it for longer. If the coffee comes to them and is super fruity or has those butyric notes that Ian was mentioning, super winey, kind of alcohol-y, vinegary flavors, the cupper or the exporter might say you should ferment it for less hours. Again, a lot of that isn't super scientifically informed. It's just this feedback loop that has happened over many years where a cupper is the one giving feedback. And also kind of seeing what's happening maybe on a farm level, using different anecdotes from the past, and providing this information. Not a lot of it is super scientific. So I would say that a lot of this this desire, at least from the origin side, from the supply side, to extend fermentation comes just from that, right? This idea that more fermentation hours in a more controlled environment lends itself to maybe a more complex cup, something that is more fruity, something that is more dynamic in its profile, something that is maybe sweeter. It wasn't until 2015 where we saw kind of this more demand side explosion for these coffees. If you all recall correctly, in 2015, there was a coffee that won the World Barista Championship that was a carbonic macerated coffee from Colombia. At this point in time, we at Cafe Imports, we all over kind of the industry started seeing this explosion in the conversation and for demand for these types of coffees. It always takes a while. There's always kind of a lag between what the demand side wants and how quickly the supply side is able to provide that. So as Ian mentioned in 2000, and let me touch on this first. I also want to note that around this time, we already started seeing these processes kind of unfold and develop naturally. And as Ian had mentioned earlier, as buyers, our responsibility is to take what someone says, what they tell us. If someone delivers us a coffee and they say this is a washed coffee, and we see it, it might look, pink or something that we might say this is probably a natural. If someone delivers us a coffee and they tell us that it's a washed coffee, we're going to sell that coffee as a washed coffee. That's kind of just our commitment to transparency that comes from someone who's producing the coffee and delivering that coffee to us. So in this time around 2015 to like 2017, I personally started, I think that this photo comes from actually 2018. I personally started seeing more extended fermentation in wash process coffees. People were putting them in bags with a water hose, kind of just a little cutout of a water hose. They were maybe covering their traditional fermentation tanks. They were putting them in plastic tanks. They were kind of finding different ways of achieving this extended fermentation, again, from this feedback loop where people are telling them maybe more hours of fermentation will lend itself to a more dynamic cup. So they're finding ways of how to extend this while also reducing risk, right? As Ian had mentioned, a lot of times these extended fermentations, if not done in a controlled environment, could be sour, vinegary, a lot of those off notes that sometimes we also associate with these anaerobic style coffees. So it's important to note that a lot of these processes were happening without us really maybe knowing, or without the producer or the exporter or the importer, or even folks on the consuming end and the roasting end placing a lot of importance on it, right? A lot of this stuff was already happening, like in critical consciousness, like this was happening on a larger level than kind of the special projects that we started maybe saying were more valuable than processes like this, this coffee that's in a bag. Around 2019, again, as Ian had mentioned, in 2020, we saw an explosion of those coffees in our lab. In 2019, I personally saw, mostly, again, anecdotally, in the south of Huila, these processes really gain in popularity. It's kind of folkloric how this stuff happens a little bit, or kind of anecdotal how this stuff happens, where someone maybe thinks of an idea or sees an idea. A lot of times it comes from Instagram, it comes from maybe direct trade buyers, like roasters themselves. A lot of it comes from us as well, where producers are like, well, we're going to experiment with something. We're going to try this. We maybe heard some rumors of how this process is unfolding somewhere else. We want to try it ourselves as well. In 2019, I was approached by a friend in the south of Huila who his direct trade client had asked for a carbonic macerated coffee or an anaerobically produced coffee. This producer had no idea what any of those terms meant, or really how to even begin this process, right? And so he came to me just as a favor. This wasn't through Cafe Imports or anything, and said, this person is offering to pay more for this coffee and is guaranteeing that they'll buy it no matter the results. They just want me to do an experiment. And so we went all around the country trying to find CO2. We drove all the way to Bogota to find it. We found these plastic tanks, one-way valves, a lot of things that were big infrastructure investments for a producer who had been processing coffee traditionally, kind of like that first slide I showed you, for the larger part of 10, 15 years. At the end of this project, we did have a control, same coffee picked on the same day. We did probably 4 different types of experiments. A lot of it wasn't super scientifically informed. It was just kind of aggregated stuff that we found on YouTube and articles that we found on Sprudge and how other people did it. But when we cupped the coffees blind, they were all kind of the same. They were probably 0.3 in cup score, pretty much the same type of coffee. Visually speaking, the ones that were produced in a carbonic macerated environment or an anaerobically modulated environment visually did look different. The coloring was a lot different. It was a lot more pink, a lot more red. It was something that in our lab, they would say in our notes, looks like a natural or looks like something else. But the point of that being is that the farmer was asked directly by a client to do this, and they did it, invested a lot in it. Thankfully, that the roaster was able to purchase this coffee no matter what at the previously agreed upon prices. But at the end of the day, a lot of the coffee was kind of just the same. So it was in 2019 that we really started seeing this kind of like at a special project level, where people were maybe talking about anaerobic fermentation, or changing their systems on the farm level, changing their infrastructure to accommodate this trend that was really growing and really developing. Again, a lot of this is reinforced by that feedback loop. So there's a voluptuation that's happening of these products in our markets, where people are saying, we want this coffee, we want this coffee, we want this coffee. And the supply side is responding to that. They see things on Instagram, they see things, people coming down and asking about those. And a lot of that, as Taya said, is partly our responsibility, right? With great power comes great responsibility. We do buy a lot of coffee, and we try to do it responsibly. But in cases like this, we're out there as well looking for these coffees, right? If our customers, if there's a demand for it, well, we say internally, oh, this might be something that we should be paying attention to, and might be something that we should have on our offerings lists. And so a lot of times that trend that's happening in our markets, there's always a delay or always a lag that's happening on the supply side in order to fulfill that. So again, there's a big balance between balancing the needs of our clients and supporting our vendors and our producer partners. Incentivizing things through good prices, and also kind of honoring the fact that there are major infrastructure investments to this for a producer, and more steps more labor involved in it, right? So obviously, it does cost more money. It's not just a voluptuation of this product, right? It's kind of both of those things in tandem, where if we are able to sell something at a higher price, we're able to buy it at a higher price, right? And that's kind of what we've been seeing. Really quickly, before I talk about Manos Juntas here, we saw this a lot with the pink bourbon explosion, which happened kind of around 2015. And we're kind of dealing with the ramifications of that now, right? So in 2015, or around then, there was a new variety, pink bourbon, discovered in San Adolfo, neighborhood of Acevedo in the south of Huila. And it kind of just exploded. It was this unique variety. It had kind of a different complexity to it. Way back then, we kind of called it like pink lemonade, a little bit. And producers took note of that. They saw how people were paying more for that. Exporters started differentiating prices not only for new and exciting varieties, but for pink bourbon itself. It's also important to note that pink bourbon as a variety behaves very differently. There's more inputs and less output from that variety, right? So it is very high producing, very high yielding coffee, but the parchment itself weighs more than traditional variety coffees, right? So while it might be more in volume, the weight, if someone's going to deliver it to someone who's just paying regular prices for regular variety coffees, they're going to get paid for that. They're not going to get paid for that loss in volume that comes from that parchment that is eventually removed, obviously. Pink bourbon typically takes more fertilizers to produce. Typically, the spacing needs to be a little bit more far apart than traditional varieties. So that means you're also planting less trees per square feet. And a lot of that, again, we are honoring that by providing kind of a differentiated price for that coffee. So part of it is the voluptuation. Part of it is the demand side saying pink bourbon is the new hot trend in the market. We want that. So we try to find that for our clients. And then so we honor that by, paying more for it. The other part of that, of course, is the inputs. So we're paying more for those inputs to the producer as well. So what's happening now? What we're seeing is that this explosion is finally realizing itself. It takes on average 7 to 8 years for a coffee from seed to tree to produce at its full production. For a farmer, for that to be fully profitable, it's about 7 to 8 years. That's quite a long time, right? And again, a lot of this trend started in 2015, where people were asking for this coffee and asking for this coffee. What we're seeing now is that most people 5, 6, 7 years ago, even in these past couple years, have been pulling out other varieties in favor of planting pink bourbon. Pink bourbon's at a differentiated price. It's maybe more expensive than your traditional Castillo, Caturra, Colombia varieties. But what we're seeing on our side is that we had this explosion in supply, and now demand is coming down for this differentiated product. And so that kind of brings up the question is like, are we going to do the same with these new modulations in fermentation? Are we going to be incentivizing a product that 10 years down the line, no one's going to really want, profiles that people aren't going to really want, or even just the terminology? Someone sees an anaerobic on our offers list and they skip right past it without even trying it or reading the notes, just because of the simple fact that it says anaerobic and they maybe have an association of the taste with it. Ways that we're kind of mitigating that, and I think that for the most part, what an importer does and what an exporter does, a big part of what we do is to mitigate risk, right? I think a lot of times, maybe a lot of the direct trade folks and a lot of people think, oh, it's just another step in the process. Maybe we can go around that step, or importers and exporters are no longer necessary. A big part of what we do and why we are important is to mitigate that risk. So that brings me to a project that we have with Banexport in Colombia called the Manos Juntas Micromill. It's in Popayán, Cauca. They're purchasing coffee in Cauca and in Huila. They're buying coffee in cherry, paying for that coffee, kind of, if you're familiar with our regional selects, at that same price level, but in cherry. The idea here being that an exporter is processing that coffee themselves, using scientific data and results and using the scientific method to achieve consistency with this coffee and taking that risk on themselves. The coffee's already paid for to the producer. If they mess this up in these tanks, they're at fault. Right? No one's asking for the producer for money back, or no one's asking, or no one, we can't also say, with feedback, well, it turned out this way, so change this on the farm level. What they're doing is that they're buying coffee based on physical analysis, right? So physical quality and not cup quality. And then the cup quality, that step comes later when we are purchasing the coffee as Cafe Imports. So this is something that's kind of important. I think for us, this is one of those products that we think about that's kind of maybe mid-range. It's not quite, it's a blended coffee from multiple producers in different communities. It's not quite a regional select, our wash standard regional product. And it's not quite a micro lot specific to one producer or something that we expect to be, 90, 91 points or something. This is a coffee that's going to be more large format, that is going to be consistent, and that is going to be produced consistently because there's scientific data that is reinforcing it and reinforcing the profile. This specifically here is a bioreactor, which is a part of their process where they inoculate the coffee with yeast and do and control kind of the processing method before it is introduced into tanks without oxygen. I think that programs like this might be the future, might be more important as we start looking at trends and how we respond to trends in the market. As I said, this is a program that is minimizing risk for the producer and creating a more consistent product that we can then offer to our clients. And so, as Taya had mentioned, there's a lot of responsibility as coffee buyers, not only us as importers or exporters, but roasters themselves. A lot of things that we need to be aware of in the market, where when we're asking for things, when we're paying attention to competitions and competition style coffees, what does that mean in the future for a lot of our supply partners? How does the rest of the world kind of behave 10 years from now when we have a lot of this coffee, when we have a lot of this product on hand, and maybe aren't able to pay different prices just because of its scarcity or how different it is? I think that that's all I had, and I believe that we are going to move into the discussion portion here. I'm not sure how much time we have, but I'll let Taya take that over, or Dylan take that over here now.
Awesome. Thank you all for giving us your insight on kind of your respective areas. Yeah, we don't have a ton of time scheduled on the call, but we are definitely willing, if people have questions, to stay a little after time and make sure we get to go through these questions. And if it wasn't obvious, because I didn't make it super obvious at first, the Q&A box is just up on the top bar. Find Q&A, click on it, and yeah, you can throw a question toward us. We'd love to answer any questions you all have. We have a couple in here. And before we get to those, we also wanted to mention, if you are going to Expo, we will be at Expo. We have an ed hour going on from 11 to 12 a.m. on Saturday. We're actually going to have two coffees from Monosuntas, the project Omar just talked about, as well as an Ethiopia and a Java anaerobic natural, both of those. And yeah, we'd love to see you at Expo if you're going to be there. But for now, we're going to stop presenting and just kind of talk through some questions. I know Taya had a couple specific questions for Ian and Omar, and then we have a couple here in the Q&A as well.
Yeah, thanks, Dylan, and thanks everybody. So we're just getting started with these series, and we set this for 1 hour because we didn't want to expect to take up a bunch of people's time. If people do have to drop off at the hour, please feel free to. We are all willing to stay on an extra, 10, 15, 20 minutes to make sure that we actually get good discussion and answer questions. So forgive us for scheduling this way, but please do stay on if you can. And just to kick things off, because I think sometimes it's sort of hard to think of your question. So I'm going to ask Ian and Omar each a question. And please, you guys in the audience, use the Q&A, put your questions in there. Dylan's going to kind of compose those and ask those of the appropriate one of us. So please do be putting your questions in there. We see a couple in there right now, and happy to see more coming in. So first off, I am going to ask Ian the question of what are you curious about now, given what you've been tasting in these coffees?
Yeah. I think what I'm most curious about is honestly like where it's all going to go. It's kind of shaky ground, right? There's risks involved, as Omar was described so well. Is it a bubble, or is it not a bubble? The advances that we've seen really year over year, and in Colombia's case, twice a year, right? We get a couple of crops out of Colombia every year. The advances that we see every sample cycle is notable. It's like it's remarkable, and so it's not slowing up at this point. You know, the sample volume is increasing. That sounds bubbly, but the transformation of the profile, the call it the stabilization or the uniformization of the profiles being presented, the lower and lower occurrence of just rotten butyric cups is really notable. So it's getting dialed, something's getting dialed in. And even as we're seeing this reduction on the bottom end, we're seeing this really fascinating avenue open up at what I would consider the top end, where coffees are labeled anaerobic. They are showing some little signs in the cup of being anaerobic, but the predominant thing that they're doing is opening up what I would consider to be one of the various kind of classic terroir profiles from wherever the coffees are. And I think that is the thing that I'm most interested to see. Is that going to continue? Is that going to flourish and open up? And maybe we won't have, 100% offering sheet of anaerobically modulated coffees, but maybe we will see some really just some really elegant or like boutique applications of this modulation to coffees that themselves are really sensitive to, oh, well, it's this variety, or it's this part of the harvest, or we're going to do it like this for a washed and like this for a honey and like this for a natural, and really start to dial in on all of the many variables here and what might that produce.
Yeah, so kind of a where are we going is both where is the profile going to go? Are we able to dial this in more, get more control over it as we understand what we're doing and what the terminology that you're tasting in the end results in? And then also where's the market going to go? Or like, is the interest going to develop along with that sort of controlling of the flavor outputs from these modulations? Thank you, Ian. All right, I got one question for Omar, and then I can see some questions are coming in, and we'll get to those next. Omar, what do you think the benefits of anaerobic fermentation are for producers? In other words, what benefit is leading them to do more of this type of modulation, especially in the cases where that information doesn't come along with the coffee? So it doesn't necessarily give that sort of trendy, sexy name with the coffee. On the ground, though, what are the benefits that you think producers are seeing where they're taking on this, like even putting coffee in bags overnight, things like that?
Yeah, so really quick, I think there's people who are raising their hands, but there's like a Q&A button at the top. It says Q&A, where I think you can go in and answer your questions. I don't think that we're going to be unmuting people specifically if they raise their hands. Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think at the end of the day, it's price, it's quality, right? I think that, again, there's this kind of idea that extended fermentation leads to higher results. Too much fermentation leads to coffee that is unpurchasable in the specialty realm, right? You got the vinegary notes or these rotten cups or butyric kind of acidity. So I think that really it just comes down to quality, right? A producer, especially if a producer is working with someone who they trust, someone who's commercializing their coffee or buying their coffee, who they trust and they trust results. A lot of it is based on trust. They're already making these modulations and already making these micro changes in their fermentation or in their processes in general to achieve desired results. And again, a lot of that comes from cupping results, cupping score, which isn't always, there might be a different cupper one day, right? There might be changes in the environment in the cupping lab and things like that. So it's always really hard to pinpoint, but I would say that at the end of the day, yeah, they're just trying to achieve, a producer wants to sell all their coffee at micro lot or AAA or whatever, whoever's purchasing the coffee calls it. They want all of their coffee to be purchased that way. And unfortunately, one of the things that I don't agree with in the specialty realm is that everything is based on quality and not necessarily the work that's put in, right? Or a lot of the inputs, right? A lot of it is based just solely on quality, and someone might have a bad year and not achieve the same results as the year previous or as their neighbor. So yeah, I think that at the end of the day, it's just kind of quality and that means price, right? I think it's also important to note that probably 20, 25 years ago, most producers in Colombia and most producers around the world didn't process their coffee themselves. That is a relatively, not in specialty. Specialty, that's kind of like the whole thing, right? We pay more for higher quality, and most producers do all the work on their own farms. But in coffee in general, in the grand scheme of things, most people 20, 25 years ago didn't have micro mills, didn't have mills on their farm, were selling their coffee in cherry or just depulped, and someone else took care of the rest of the processes.
Thank you for that description. All right, Dylan, you want to hit us with, since you've been watching the questions come in?
Yeah, I think I've got so far 3 really good questions that kind of hit some different areas. The first one from Coder, kind of going back to farm level things, are all fermentations anaerobic? Are there some microorganisms that favor an anaerobic environment, and are there differences in flavor profiles in aerobic versus anaerobic? So it's kind of a 3-part question. It's one of the first ones we got in the Q&A. If y'all want to tackle that one.
Yeah, I can go ahead and take a stab at it, and Omar, Ian, feel free to add on or interrupt me, or any of all of the above. Are all fermentations anaerobic? Sort of depends on how we're using that term fermentation. Like we talked about earlier, the actual chemical reactions taking place in fermentation are anaerobic, meaning that they don't utilize oxygen molecules. However, the way that I am presenting the term anaerobic fermentation, where we're just talking about the environment around the coffee and whether that's free oxygen or low oxygen, in that case, no, not all fermentations are anaerobic. There's often actually sort of very, very, very common, just sort of an open vat that the coffee is in, and there either is water added or not added to that. And there's a lot of oxygen just sort of freely there in that ambient environment. And your second question, are there some microorganisms that favor the anaerobic environment? Absolutely. I would actually say it the other way around, where the anaerobic or aerobic environment favor certain microorganisms. Microorganisms are can be very, very, very sensitive. There are some that are more generalist and some that are very sensitive to things like the amount of oxygen in the environment, temperature, pH. So how we manipulate which microorganisms are present, and there's a lot of study going on right now to really identify the microorganisms and how we can manipulate and get each one, or each sort of family of them really, is with these modulations. So if you modify the amount of oxygen, you are modifying the microorganisms, and that is what's actually doing the work to change how the fermentation takes place and the flavor profiles that are a result of that. So the environment favors or does not favor those microbes through anaerobic, aerobic, through pH, through the amount of sugars present, things like that. Are there differences in flavor profiles between the aerobic versus anaerobic? I hope you've heard some of that throughout the rest of the talk. I know you threw this question up pretty early on in the discussion. Yes, there are, not in every case, as Omar gave us a case where they tried a bunch of different modulations to the same coffees, and in the end, they sort of came out the same. In those cases, maybe they weren't modifying the microorganism population quite enough to get very different results. They could have maybe changed pH or things like that. You can add citrus that will make more of an acidic pH, and that might change the profile differently. And then there's also a factor of time. So the aerobic versus anaerobic, if you make the anaerobic environment and put your coffee in it, and then you only leave it in there for a very short period of time, that does not seem to have as much of an impact as a longer period of time in that anaerobic environment. And actually, however, I think there are still some benefits. In some cases, what may be happening is more of just a homogenization within the coffee. So if you think about that, you've picked a bunch of coffee from all different sort of corners of fields with different people's hands throughout the day at different temperatures. You start off cooler, the day got hotter, the day got cooler again. There's a lot of differences in temperature and the microorganism load that are on all those different coffees, and resting coffee all together in the same space at the same temperature allows homogenization of the microorganisms throughout that whole batch of coffee and from batch to batch. So from day to day, from season to season, there might be a little bit more of a control where you're going to get this more of the same results day in and day out and season in and season out with those shorter anaerobic or sort of resting periods, like a 24-hour period that we call a pre-ferment right now in Guatemala. So I think some of the benefits are not necessarily this major change in flavor profile if you got a shorter anaerobic step, but a homogenization that overall is beneficial. Okay, that's Dylan.
Yeah. Anybody else have anything to add to that? I have a really, let's see, interesting questions here from Alberto in Costa Rica. He just pushed it through for us. And Omar, this is kind of speaking to what you were just talking about. This question is related to the variation in the weight of the coffee in these processes. According to some studies carried out in Costa Rica, the cupping profile increases, but the weight decreases compared to other processes. Any idea for the reason of this behavior?
Honestly, I have no idea. I don't know, Ian, if you have any thoughts on that.
I have a thought. Sorry, Ian, do you have a thought? Go for it.
Let's hear your thought, Taya.
Okay. My thought, I recently took the fermentation course from Lucia Solis, and she made the point that when we do these real specialty processes, we're also creating more opportunities for sorting. And that's actually one of the reasons why she believes that some of these coffees come out better is because we've taken them from the field and maybe we've floated them and then we've put them into crates to move and then we've put them in the containers to ferment and then we've taken them out. And every time that we do that, we allow our eyes to look at the coffee and our hands to get into the coffee. And this may not be what you're referring to, Alberto, but I do believe that we are giving ourselves more opportunities to remove defects from those coffees and that they're going to come out with maybe cleaner flavor profiles because of that, which in some cases we're attributing to the process, but also you're going to reduce your output of high quality coffee and you're going to actually increase your output of discards or coffee seconds. So that's one thought as to why that might be happening. If it's not from removing defects, I'm not sure, but we have sort of a list of running thoughts and little pieces of evidence that we have these type of questions about that we are considering doing some deeper investigation into. So if this is not about the sorting and culling of defects, then that's a great question that we'll have to look into further.
I have another question here coming in. Kind of speaking back to flavor profile, would you say that modulation is a complement to origin flavor, or maybe more for some and not others? And also, have we noticed a difference between this modulation mixed with other processes? So some kind of like anaerobic honey, washed, natural, etc.
I know Ian probably has a really good response to this, but I wanted to jump in and also say that we're kind of seeing that like terroir, like those attributes a little bit less and less. And I think I attribute that to just like the globalization, for lack of a better word, of coffee itself, right? The exchanging of ideas, the fact that SL28 doesn't just exist in Kenya or Costa Rica, it's all over the place. You know, that varieties are adapting to many different places. And a lot of these processes as well are kind of taking on a lot of the predominant flavor notes versus something like terroir. So yeah, I just wanted to step in and say that I think, you know, there was a time where we probably could have been like, this is a Costa Rican coffee and this is a Colombian coffee, and they were both washed Caturas, right? But I feel like we're seeing that less and less just with all these other, this exchange of ideas happening all over the world and kind of the opening up of specialty coffee in general.
So I can add to that. I think that so we assess coffees based on, historically we called it the processing, but I think more accurately we should call it categories or standards. And we started doing this because prior everything was just essentially a default cupped against a wash standard. So if you had a wet hulled coffee, if you had a natural coffee, those were being assessed from a washed, call it a washed centric perspective. If you think about assessing a lager and using a lager standard, and someone hands you the best stout in the world, well, it might be the best stout in the world, but it's a terrible lager, right? So we took a similar perspective with coffee and created these so-called processing standards or assessment standards. So as an example, for the natural assessment standard, the question was, what makes a good natural coffee? What are we looking for in a natural coffee? What is a natural coffee buyer or connoisseur looking for from a natural coffee? What do we expect to see? And what do we not want to see? And so within that context, you start by making that shift in how you approach processing or process modulation. And then from there, you can really start to identify things. So to your question here, in some instances, the anaerobic modulation masks any sort of variety or origin profile or flavor. We've had Brazilian coffees that I would not be able to distinguish from Colombian coffees, from Indian coffees, from Hawaiian coffees, from Ethiopian coffees. That's on one end of the spectrum, and back in the presentation, that was the primary anaerobic profile that I was describing. That is very process heavy, or very modulation heavy. That's what we're tasting, and there's not really terroir of any sort to speak of within that. On the other hand, there are instances where we're seeing the modulation seeming to enhance the so-called origin flavor or terroir flavor. And you know, that's much less, but I think that's the place where I'm really curious and interested to see develop.
Let's go to this question. I think this is a really interesting question that Omar was able to collect for us from somebody here. Jake asked about our thoughts on how you would navigate conversations with producers that may be quote unquote late to the anaerobic trend. Would we discourage a producer from investing in infrastructure if they are really good at producing traditional washed coffees? Or yeah, how do we talk about this with producers?
Yeah, that's always the difficulty, right? Like I said, kind of like with great power comes great responsibility, you know, like yeah, I guess it's dependent on many factors. If it's something that you want to forge forward with and be a true partner and say, if you want to, as a producer, experiment with this, but are risk averse and don't know what the results are going to be, and if we can, and if we're able to partner on a project with someone, then yeah, let's move forward with this, right? But if I can't guarantee to that person that I'm going to buy it, really, I just say that you're an entrepreneur, you're a business person yourself, and these are risks that you have to take, and that's really, honestly, your decision. In a lot of cases, sometimes when we're buying, I mean, a lot of things that we're doing are proactive, right? There's a lot of programs and partnerships that we have with a lot of people, but sometimes it's reactive, and we have the ability to say no to things, right? If someone comes to us and they say, hey, we've got this crazy new koji banana peel process. Do you want to try it? Really, it's dependent on, do we have the space? Is it the right price? Is it something that we can commercialize and sell? And will our lab approve it? Which means will our customers want it, right? Because I would consider our lab very in tune with what our customers want. So really at that level, I, as a buyer, for a company like Cafe Imports, don't try to encourage or discourage producers from doing anything, right? I think that our actions also speak volumes, right? If we're saying we're differentiating a price for anaerobics or we're differentiating a price for pink for bones, then the market does start to move that way. But I personally would never just tell a producer, I mean, in the context that Jake's asking, someone is coming to him and saying, we want to do anaerobics, right? That's what it sounds like. And they're super good at producing traditional washed natural coffees. I would give my honest feedback and just say, as a client of yours, I want to purchase your washed and natural coffees, and I cannot guarantee a purchase of other coffees, or what the process might be like, because I haven't tasted it yet, right? Now, if you wanted to go ahead and partner up and say, I will buy whatever you produce and we can do this together, then that's a different thing. But yeah, I try to stay away from directly telling someone kind of what they should or shouldn't do. And again, like I said, as kind of a fixture in the industry and a fixture in like places like the south of Wheeler, where we buy a lot of coffee, we do encourage and discourage things just by our actions, right? So that is, I try not to do it personally if I can't guarantee that I'm going to purchase something. But overall, how we operate does encourage and discourage different things at origin, right?
I can add to that a little bit too. I get put on the spot sometimes, as Dr. Brown walking around the field and people ask me what they should or shouldn't do. And I'm very aware of the responsibility there, and that I might be the only person from a land of consumption that has visited that producer that year. They really want to hang on my every word, and I want to give them something. So in those cases, what I do personally is talk to them about scale. If they want to try something, try it really small. See how it comes out on a really small scale. Reduce your risk. Don't go changing your whole offering profile, all of your offerings to that kind of coffee. Try it really small, see how you like it. This is also where the feedback loop of cupping is very important. If you have a relationship where you can cup the coffee and you can give them feedback on how you think that coffee is valued based compared to the other coffees that they're producing, if they try it on a really small scale, I think that's incredibly valuable. If they are really, really excited about it and just want to try it, that's what I do, is say start really small. And then also when you're experimenting, one of the things that I see people do is to jump ahead and change like 5 variables from batch to batch. And I just say slow down, okay, we've got this batch which was at this temperature and this pH and this variety and this elevation, and then this batch where all those things are different. Change just one thing. if you're at a place where you're experimenting and you're seeing how these come out, and take in a lot where it's the same coffee picked the same day, and break it into different, let's say 5 nanolots, and change only one variable between each of those. If you change a ton of variables, you're never going to know which of those variables it was that gave you that different outcome. If one of those 5 coffees is coming out really good or really bad, or there's sort of a spectrum, you want to be able to pinpoint which variable is giving you that result. So those are the kind of tools that I try to give people so that it's still in their hands. It's still their directive to make these decisions or not, but they have a little bit of a tool set, a little bit of a kind of a scientific process that they can walk through to get themselves to their own answer to that question. And again, if you can offer cupping feedback, visit them, offer that kind of support, I think that's huge. So I think that's a great thing to offer.
Those are both great answers. We had one more question, and then maybe we can wrap up. We haven't had any more come in. And this is one that I know Omar has had personal experience with, and I know Taya can speak to, but it was from Coder a little earlier. Does the producer add specific microorganism like wine or beer makers do, or does the bacteria and yeast just exist in that specific environment?
Yeah, I'll let Taya take on this one, but I think it's both.
Yeah, short answer, it's both. There are in all of our environments microorganisms that are floating around. There's some crazy statistics about how much of our own bodies are actually made up of microorganisms, like some amount of the pounds when you weigh yourself is actually microorganisms that exist in your body that help us break down food in our system and all kinds of other processes. So microorganisms abound. They are everywhere. They are acting all the time. They are the reason for decay in most things, and very useful part of our ecosystem in that way. We are harnessing that by creating the environment to foster certain microorganisms. So there's a very passive or spontaneous fermentation that will happen whether you do anything. If you just leave a banana on your countertop, it will decay. That is not necessarily anything that you've specifically done. You can also try to foster different microorganisms by adding salt, by changing the pH, so by adding something that's acidic or basic, by changing the temperature. And there's a few other tools or kind of like levers that we can pull, which will modify the communities of microorganisms that are present. And then there's also adding microorganisms. So we can totally add microorganisms. Those microorganisms, I can't say that word. Sorry, guys. Those little guys that are acting, yeast, bacteria, etc. They're still impacted by all those same things that any of them are. So you usually kind of both. You'll add a yeast and you'll also make sure that the temperature and pH is right for that yeast. So you want to favor that yeast that you're adding. You're spending money on it. It's even in some cases like relatively expensive as far as in addition to the whole production of coffee, where you're starting from seed and or plantlets in the field and all of the investment there, and then you add in this thing that costs you 20 cents a pound in the end, or whatever the cost is. So that's an added cost to you. So one of the things that you can do to make sure that those microorganisms that you're investing in are going to do really well is to really do a lot of research on them and understand their pH needs, their temperature needs, their aerobic versus anaerobic environment needs, and you can foster an environment that will then allow those guys that you have added into the system to flourish Otherwise, if you're adding the microorganisms in and then the environment isn't great for them, you're still sort of favoring the existing microorganisms. So those are kind of all different levers that we can pull, and they're all slightly different. And everybody in the world that's playing with these things are playing with kind of pulling each lever in a slightly different way for their own case. What kind of investment ability they have, what kind of understanding they have of how the microorganisms live. There's the Banexport example where they've got microscopes and they're actually growing microorganisms from the environment. That was that last slide that Omar showed with the Petri dishes. And so that's a very high level of sophistication, all the way to, just open air tanks, and you sort of hope things work well. There's also microorganisms in the water that's used. There is a conversation about the level of cleanliness that's important in fermentation tanks. In some cases, people can really improve their cup profile by cleaning tanks really well in between. And in some cases, you lose something. Somebody comes in and says, "Oh, you're using these old rotten looking tanks, let's get you some new ones." They put in stainless steel new tanks, and the coffee doesn't come out the same ever again, because you've lost what was living in the wood or the concrete that was in that system. So it's all very nuanced. It's all things that everybody's learning and sort of taking on little aspects of this and nuances of this in their own case. And they all will produce slightly different results for different people. And because of how nuanced and detailed and sort of differentiated each of these steps are, there really isn't a recipe that fits everyone. Which is part of the issue of this responsibility and of what, Omar's talking about as far as the way he's going to talk to producers. And, there just isn't one recipe that we can say, yeah, do this and it'll improve your cup score, or it'll come out in a higher value or more homogenized coffee. Yeah. So it's fun and difficult to navigate all of these things.
Totally. Wonderful, everybody. I personally want to thank every person for joining us and for sticking around. And yeah, on behalf of Omar, Ian, and Taya, and Cafe Imports as a whole, we really appreciate y'all taking the time to be part of today's conversation. And we'll be following up with everybody soon and let you know where the recording is and all of that. Thank you
And
all.
please do email us at education@cafeimports.com.
And come see us at our booth at Expo.
Yeah, if you're at Expo,
That
please
too.
come see us. 11 to 12 on Saturday. We have anaerobic coffees for you guys to try.
That's right. Wonderful. Y'all have a great afternoon, morning, evening, wherever you are. Thank you.